This story is titled, My Parents Secretly Forged My Signature to Secure a $180,000 loan for my sister's wedding. When I showed up, I realized they had given me the wrong address, so I made sure the wedding gets canceled. Hi, everyone. Before we dive in, a quick favor. If you enjoy content like this, please hit the subscribe button. It's free, supports the channel, and makes sure you never miss out on amazing videos. All right, let's get started. Hello, everyone. This is my first time posting here, and honestly, I'm feeling a little awkward about it. Sharing personal stuff online isn't really my thing, but I've been sitting on this for a while now, and it's been eating away at me. I figured maybe putting it out here could give me some perspective or advice. So here goes nothing. A few months ago, I, 32 female, got this unexpected call from my bank. I wasn't expecting any issues with my account, so I answered without a second thought. The guy on the other end started talking about a loan application, $180,000 to be exact, that had been approved in my name. For a second, I didn't even process what he was saying. I thought it had to be a scam or some kind of mix-up. I mean, $180,000? That's not pocket change. I asked him to repeat himself, trying to figure out what he meant. He explained that the loan had been approved 2 weeks earlier and that the funds had already been released. That's when my brain went into full panic mode. I told him there must be a mistake because I'd never applied for any loan, let alone one that big. He stayed calm and asked if I wanted to dispute it. Dispute it? I didn't even know what to say. How do you dispute something you didn't even know existed? I asked him to send over all the paperwork they had on file, thinking maybe someone had stolen my identity. He agreed and emailed me the documents right away. When the email came through, I sat there staring at my laptop for what felt like an eternity. My name was on every single page. My signature was at the bottom of each document. But here's the thing. It wasn't my signature. It looked close, like someone had tried to copy it, but I could tell right away it wasn't mine. At first, I thought, who would do this? I don't have enemies, and I've never been careless with my personal information. Then I noticed something on the application that made my heart sink. My parents' address was listed under the secondary contact. I don't know how to explain it, but I just knew they were involved. It felt like all the air had been sucked out of the room. Now let me get this clear. My relationship with my parents has never been perfect. Growing up, I was always in the background. My younger sister, Madison, always been the kind of person who could snap her fingers and have my parents jump into action. Money for a new hobby? Done. Extra time for some last-minute school project she forgot about? They'd drop everything. Meanwhile, I was the low-maintenance child, the one who didn't need much, or at least that's what they convinced themselves. If I asked for something, it was always met with a sigh, a lecture about responsibility, or the classic, can't you handle it on your own? And I did, because what else could I do? I learned pretty quickly that relying on them just wasn't worth the energy. Madison is 28 now, and still the reigning queen of their universe. She's engaged to Kyle, a guy who seems decent enough, and they've been planning the kind of wedding that looks straight out of a magazine. I wouldn't know all the details, though, because I'm barely looped in. Madison and I don't have that close sibling bond you'd hope for. It's always been clear we're living in two different worlds. Hers, where everything is handed to her, and mine, where I have to work twice as hard to get half the recognition. Even now, she's spoiled. And I'm, well, the one they assume will figure it out no matter what. I didn't want to jump to conclusions, so I called my mom. I asked her straight up if she knew anything about a $180,000 loan in my name. At first, there was this weird pause, and then she said, "Oh, that's for Madison's wedding." I couldn't believe what I was hearing. I asked her to explain, and she went into this whole thing about how Madison wanted an extravagant wedding, but didn't have the money to pay for it. My parents decided to help her out by taking out a loan, but instead of applying for it themselves, they used my name. Apparently, they thought it was easier because I had better credit. When I told her that forging my signature was a crime, she got defensive. She said, "We're family. You'd help if we asked, wouldn't you?" I couldn't even respond for a moment because I was so stunned. I told her that asking and committing fraud were two very different things. She didn't seem to care. She said they didn't want to bother me because they knew I was busy with work. Like that made it okay. Then I called my dad. I thought maybe he'd have a better explanation, but no. He was even worse. He acted like I was the one overreacting. He said, "It's for your sister. You should be happy to support her on her big day." He even added some nonsense about how this is what families do for each other. That's when I realized just how deep they were into this. They didn't even think they'd done anything wrong. In their minds, this was totally normal. I hung up before I said something I'd regret. I couldn't even find the words. My head was spinning, my pulse pounding in my ears. How do you respond to that level of ignorance? I felt sick, like the ground had been ripped out from under me. Before I could say something I'd regret, or maybe just unleash everything I was holding back, I hung up. I sat there for a long time, staring at the wall, floored by how casually they'd decided my life was theirs to gamble with. This wasn't just a mistake or a lapse in judgment. It was deliberate. They had planned it, executed it, and justified it without so much as a second thought about me. After I hung up, I learned something that just made the betrayal sting even more. Apparently, my parents had first gone to Kyle's family asking for help with the wedding costs. They'd wanted them to pitch in for the extra touches Madison had her heart set on, but Kyle's family had refused. From what I heard, they'd agreed to pay for a portion of the basics, like the catering and the venue, but they set firm limits. They weren't willing to go beyond that, and they'd made it clear that Madison and Kyle needed to live within their means. Instead of accepting that, my parents decided to take matters into their own hands. They didn't want to disappoint Madison, so they found another way to get the money. And that other way just so happened to involve my name and my credit. After that, I just sat there, trying to process everything. I didn't even know where to start. My credit was now tied to this massive loan, and if my parents or Madison missed even one payment, I'd be the one responsible. Worse, the loan contract had all these terms about repayment. If they defaulted, the bank could demand the full amount immediately. I hadn't agreed to any of this, but now my financial future was hanging by a thread. I didn't sleep much that night. I kept thinking about how my parents could do this to me. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the fact that they didn't even ask. They didn't think about how this would affect me. They just saw me as a convenient option, someone they could use to solve their problem. The next day, I contacted a lawyer. I explained everything, and they said I had a strong case, but it wouldn't be easy. Turns out, my parents had already spent most of the loan on wedding deposits and vendors, so the money was gone. The lawyer recommended starting by reporting the fraud to the bank and gathering all the documents I'd need to take legal action. It was going to be a long process, but I didn't see any other choice. I wasn't going to let this slide. As I threw myself into figuring out what to do next, between calls with my lawyer and sorting through bank documents, I barely had time to think about the wedding itself. To be honest, I assumed I wasn't invited. Why would I be, after all this? My relationship with Madison was already rocky, and now I'd confronted my parents about their fraud. An invitation seemed unlikely, but about a week before what I thought was the wedding date, I got a formal invitation in the mail. It was ridiculously fancy, embossed gold lettering on thick paper, the kind of thing that probably cost a small fortune. The venue was listed as some upscale estate about 3 hours from where I live. For a second, I thought maybe this was their way of trying to smooth things over, like sending the invitation would magically erase all the betrayal. At first, I considered skipping it. The thought of sitting through an event funded by the loan they'd stolen my name for made my blood boil. But the more I thought about it, the angrier I got. Why should I stay home? They dragged me into this mess. So why should they get the satisfaction of pretending everything was fine without me there? So I decided to go. Not to make a scene or anything, I just wanted to see this wedding for myself. I wanted to look them in the eye and see if they could really stand there and celebrate without a shred of guilt. If nothing else, I figured it would give me some closure. The day of what I thought was the wedding, I got up early and started getting ready. I wasn't going to dress to impress, but I also didn't want to look like I didn't belong there. I threw on a decent dress, grabbed the invitation, and set off for the venue. The drive was long, but I didn't mind. It gave me time to rehearse what I might say if I ran into my parents or Madison. A dozen versions of the conversation played out in my head, each one more confrontational than the last. When I finally arrived at the address on the invitation, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a venue, it was a parking lot. An empty, run-down parking lot with cracked asphalt and weeds sprouting everywhere. There wasn't a single car in sight. No decorations, no signs of a wedding, nothing. I double-checked the invitation, thinking maybe I'd made a mistake. But no, the address matched exactly. I sat in my car for a minute, staring at the empty lot, trying to make sense of it. Had the venue changed? Was the wedding postponed? If either was true, why didn't anyone tell me? I pulled out my phone and called my mom. She picked up after a few rings, sounding distracted. When I asked what was going on, she said, "Oh, didn't Madison tell you? The date got pushed back, and we had to change the venue a few days ago." She said it so casually, like it was no big deal. I asked her for the new address, and she hesitated before adding, "You know what? The ceremony's not happening yet. There's no point in you worrying about it." I was stunned. "So you just forgot to tell me?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She brushed it off, saying something about being too busy with wedding preparations, and then hung up before I could respond. I sat there in that empty parking lot, staring at my phone, feeling like a fool. I thought about just going home, but something told me to call Madison. Maybe, just maybe, she'd have a better explanation. Maybe this was all some kind of miscommunication. When she picked up, I barely got a word out before she started laughing. Not just laughing, mocking me. "Oh, so you actually showed up? You didn't get the hint?" she said, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "You really thought you were welcome?" Her words hit me like a brick. I didn't even know how to respond. Before I could say anything, she hung up too. That was it. I was done. If I wasn't already furious about the loan, this pushed me over the edge. They didn't just steal my name for their fraud, they deliberately left me out, humiliated me, and then had the audacity to act like it was no big deal. When I got home, I threw the invitation in the trash and sat down to write everything out. I started listing every conversation, every interaction, every detail I could remember. My lawyer had told me to document everything, and now I understood why. This wasn't just about money, it was about setting boundaries. If they could do this to me once, they could do it again. I needed to protect myself. By the end of the day, I had a clear plan. I was going to keep fighting this. They'd made their choice, and now I was going to make mine. No more second chances, no more excuses. It was time to hold them accountable for everything they'd done. The day after the fake wedding invitation debacle, I contacted my lawyer again. I was done playing nice. The loan fraud was one thing, but deliberately misleading me and making me drive 3 hours to a dead-end address? That was a whole new level of disrespect. It was clear they didn't see me as a person with feelings or a future. I was just a tool for them to use. I also called the bank again to explain the situation in detail and asked for any additional records related to the loan. My parents weren't happy when they found out I'd hired a lawyer. My mom called me first, crying about how I was tearing the family apart. She kept saying things like, "We're your parents. We raised you. How could you do this to us?" It was laughable, honestly. They'd just forged my signature and ruined my trust, and now I was the one being painted as the bad guy? I stayed calm and told her this wasn't about hurting anyone. It was about protecting myself. She didn't care. She just kept talking about how I was blowing things out of proportion and how family should stick together. I told her, if family is so important, maybe you should have thought about that before committing fraud. That shut her up for a moment, but it didn't last. My dad called me right after, and he was much angrier. He started yelling about how I was being rude and how Madison deserved the wedding of her dreams. He said something like, "You're her sister. It's your duty to help her." I told him that helping someone doesn't mean sacrificing your future for them, especially when you're not even asked. The calls didn't stop there. Over the next few days, I heard from cousins, aunts, and even a few family friends. Apparently, my parents had started spreading the word that I was suing them out of greed. No one seemed to care about the fact that they'd forged my signature and put me at financial risk. All they saw was the headline, "Daughter Sues Parents." I started getting texts like, "Aren't they your parents? Can't you just work it out?" Or, "Family should come first no matter what." It was exhausting. Everyone had an opinion, but no one wanted to hear mine. Meanwhile, Madison stayed silent. She didn't reach out, didn't call, didn't text, nothing. Part of me wondered if she felt guilty. After all, she was the one who'd benefited the most from all this. But another part of me doubted she even cared. Madison had always been good at letting our parents fight her battles for her. She'd sit back, play the victim, and let them clean up the mess. As all this was happening, the legal process started to move forward. My lawyer filed a formal fraud report with the bank, and they launched their own investigation. The bank was surprisingly cooperative, probably because they didn't want to be held liable for approving a fraudulent loan. They assured me that as long as I continued to dispute the loan and provided evidence, I wouldn't be responsible for the debt. That was a relief, but it wasn't the end of the road. My lawyer explained that we'd need to pursue the matter in civil court to make sure my parents couldn't pull anything like this again. Fraud cases are messy, and the fact that this was within the family made it even more complicated. But I wasn't backing down. As the investigation unfolded, more details came to light. My parents had falsified financial records to make the loan application look more convincing. They'd exaggerated their income and listed assets they didn't even own. It was shocking to see how far they were willing to go. This wasn't just a moment of poor judgment. They'd planned this. The bank flagged the loan as fraudulent and froze the account the money had been deposited into. My lawyer said this would make it harder for my parents to access the remaining funds, but it also meant the vendors and deposits for the wedding were likely in limbo. That didn't bother me. If they wanted to play games, they could deal with the fallout. Around this time, I started hearing whispers that Madison's wedding might be in trouble. Some family members mentioned that vendors were pulling out or refusing to provide services until payments were sorted. It was ironic, really. The wedding they'd gone to such great lengths to fund was now at risk of falling apart. I wasn't celebrating, though. This wasn't about revenge. It was about protecting myself and making sure they understood that what they did was unacceptable. If the wedding suffered because of their choices, that was on them, not me. One of the hardest parts of this whole ordeal was the isolation. My parents' smear campaign had worked, at least within the family. People who I thought would have my back were suddenly distant or outright hostile. I stopped answering most of the calls and texts because it wasn't worth the stress. The few people who did support me told me to stay strong and reminded me that I wasn't in the wrong. I clung to that. But you know what hurt me the most? It wasn't just the betrayal itself. It was the fact that my parents and Madison knew I was about to start a business, knew I was planning to quit my job to focus on it, and still went through with this. They knew I'd spent months securing funding and finding investors, and that I'd be financially vulnerable for a while as I got things off the ground. Yet, none of that mattered to them. They didn't hesitate to gamble with my future just to fund Madison's wedding. They didn't care what it would mean for me if things fell apart. They only cared about what Madison wanted. Through it all, I kept thinking about my parents' mindset. They genuinely seemed to believe they'd done nothing wrong. In their eyes, this was just helping Madison, as though that made it okay to commit fraud and put me at risk. But at what cost? They were willing to risk everything. My credit, my finances, my stability, just to give her the wedding of her dreams. It was like my life, my plans, and everything I'd worked hard for didn't even register in their decision-making process. As the days passed, I tried to avoid thinking about Madison. She'd been silent through the fallout, which didn't surprise me. This was her usual approach: let our parents shield her from the consequences of her actions, while she acted like she was above it all. But the longer she stayed quiet, the more suspicious I got. If she was as innocent as she wanted everyone to believe, why wasn't she reaching out to defend herself? I figured her silence was strategic. If she ignored me, she probably thought I'd let it go and focus on our parents instead. That wasn't going to happen. I decided I needed answers. If she knew about the loan and played a role in it, I wasn't going to let her skate by while our parents took the heat. I texted her, keeping it short and to the point. "Did you know about the loan before the wedding?" She left me on red for hours. When she finally responded, all she said was, "I don't know what you're talking about." I could practically hear her smug tone through the screen. It was infuriating. I fired back, telling her I knew she had to be involved because there was no way our parents would have done this without consulting her. If not, she was the one who pushed them to take this move. But she doubled down, saying it was none of her business and that she didn't want to get dragged into family drama. That was enough for me to start connecting the dots. Madison wasn't denying it because she didn't know. She was denying it because she didn't want to be caught. I knew her well enough to recognize when she was lying. She was too involved with our parents to not have known where the money came from. I thought about letting it go, but the more I replayed her words in my head, the angrier I got. Her fiancé, Kyle, deserved to know the truth. So did his family. I opened his Facebook profile and wrote out a long message on Messenger. I didn't hold back. I told him everything: how the loan was taken out in my name, how my parents forged my signature, and how Madison had likely known all along. I also advised him to break off the engagement and think carefully about marrying into a family that could commit such actions. I didn't stop there. I also sent the same message to a few of Madison's close friends, people who had been gushing about her wedding on social media. I didn't care if it made me look petty. They deserved to know what kind of family they are dealing with. But deep down, I couldn't help but wonder if I had gone too far. But I really wanted to find out if my sister knew about the loan. Madison had built her life on the backs of other people's sacrifices, and it was time for her to face the consequences. Within a day, I started hearing whispers through mutual friends that Kyle had confronted Madison about the loan. Apparently, she tried to play dumb at first, but when he pressed her, she cracked. She admitted she'd known about the loan from the beginning. Not only that, but she'd even encouraged our parents to go through with it because she didn't want to be stuck with the wedding costs. Hearing that was both validating and infuriating. I'd suspected she was involved, but knowing she had actively encouraged it made my blood boil. She knew how much this would hurt me, and she didn't care. All that mattered to her was getting her dream wedding, no matter the cost. It didn't take long for Kyle to call off the engagement. He wasn't the type to tolerate dishonesty, and Madison's actions clearly crossed a line for him. From what I heard, he told her that if she could lie about something this big, he couldn't trust her in a marriage. His family backed him up, cutting ties with Madison completely. When my parents found out, they started begging me. They called nonstop, pleading for me to fix things and take back what I had said. My mom kept saying, "We can still fix this if you just undo the damage," and tried to guilt me into believing I'd overreacted. When begging didn't work, their tone shifted to anger. They accused me of destroying Madison's life. My dad yelled that I'd humiliated her and ruined everything they had worked so hard to give her. "You've torn this family apart," he said, blaming me for the fallout. My mom doubled down, saying, "How is she supposed to recover from this? You've betrayed your own sister." When I stood firm, they turned it into a personal attack. My mom accused me of being jealous of Madison, saying, "You've always had a problem with her. This is just you trying to ruin her happiness. Her wedding matters more than your already failed business." Their masks were tearing up. You know the real truth of people when they are most angry. Then Madison finally decided to contact me. I answered, and she immediately launched into a tirade. She blamed me for everything: her engagement falling apart, her wedding being canceled, even the tension between our parents and me. "You ruined my life," she said. "If you hadn't been such a bitch, none of this would have happened." I couldn't believe her audacity. I reminded her that she'd been part of the plan from the start, that she knew the loan was fraudulent and didn't care how it affected me. She denied it at first, but when I pressed her, she admitted it. "I thought it would be fine," she said. "I didn't think the bank would contact you. I figured we could keep it quiet until after the wedding. But you blew up everything? Are you happy now?" Her words hit me like a slap. She didn't even try to justify what she'd done. She just assumed it wouldn't matter because she thought she'd get away with it. I told her that her lack of foresight wasn't my problem, and that she needed to take responsibility for her actions. She fired back, calling me a terrible sister and accusing me of sabotaging her life out of jealousy. Exactly what my mom said. Obviously, she fills their heads with her nonsense. That was the last straw for me. I told her that if anyone had sabotaged her life, it was her. She made the decision to involve herself in the fraud. She made the decision to lie to her fiancé and her friends. I wasn't going to take the blame for her choices. After that, she hung up on me. I haven't heard from her since. In the days that followed, Madison moved out of her apartment and in with a friend. From what I've gathered, her life has been a mess ever since Kyle left her. She's been posting vague, useless messages on social media about betrayal and family loyalty, clearly aimed at me. I've ignored them. I'm not interested in engaging with her games anymore. After Madison's meltdown, things went quiet. Too quiet, honestly. For weeks, I didn't hear a word from her or my parents. The silence wasn't comforting, though. It felt like the calm before a storm. My lawyer had warned me that things might escalate as the bank's fraud investigation progressed, so I stayed prepared. Every text, email, and document was neatly saved and ready to go. One afternoon, my lawyer called with an update. The bank's investigation had confirmed everything on my end: the forged signature, the fabricated income documents, the unauthorized loan application. They assured me that I wouldn't be held responsible for any payments. That was a huge relief. At least I didn't have to worry about my credit being tanked any further. But my parents weren't off the hook. The bank had flagged their actions as fraud and reported it to the authorities. The legal system doesn't take lightly to forge documents and $180,000 disappearing into thin air. My lawyer explained that while the bank was pursuing criminal charges, I still had the option to file a civil suit against my parents. It wouldn't just be about the money. It would be about holding them accountable for what they did. A few days later, I got a call from my dad. It wasn't his usual angry, defensive tone. Instead, he sounded tired. "We need to talk," he said. I agreed. I wasn't expecting an apology, though, but I wanted to hear what he had to say. When we spoke, he started by trying to justify everything again. "We only did this because we wanted to help Madison," he said. "We didn't think it would get this far." I stopped him there. "You didn't think it would get this far because you didn't think I'd find out," I told him. "That's not an excuse." He sighed and told me they'd talk to a lawyer of their own. They wanted to settle. If I agreed to drop the civil suit, they'd pay me a lump sum of money as compensation for the damage they'd caused. He didn't give me a number right away, but he said it would be substantial. I didn't respond immediately. On one hand, a settlement could resolve things quickly and give me the resources to rebuild. On the other hand, it felt like letting them off easy. They'd betrayed me in such a deep, deliberate way, and part of me wanted to see them face the full consequences. But I knew dragging this out in court would take time, money, and emotional energy I wasn't sure I had. My lawyer and I went over the offer in detail once they formally submitted it. It was a significant amount, enough to cover the damage to my finances and help me jumpstart my plans for a business. But it wasn't just about the money. Accepting the settlement meant I'd have to agree not to pursue any further legal action against them. It was a clean break, legally speaking, but it didn't feel clean emotionally. I spent days weighing my options. I thought about all the plans I'd put on hold because of this mess. Starting a business had been my dream for years, but the loan and the potential legal battle had derailed everything. The settlement money would allow me to finally focus on building something for myself, free from the financial stress my parents had caused. At the same time, I felt conflicted. Would accepting the settlement send the wrong message? Would it make my parents think I'd forgiven them? The betrayal was still fresh, and I didn't want them to believe that money could erase what they'd done. But my lawyer reminded me that this wasn't about forgiveness. It was about practical solutions. The settlement wasn't a favor. It was restitution for the damage they'd caused. As the deadline to accept the offer approached, I decided to meet with my Aunt Clara. She'd been one of the few family members who hadn't taken sides during all this. She wasn't trying to guilt me into backing down or blaming me for standing up for myself. Instead, she just listened. We met at a small coffee shop near her house. I told her everything, how I felt torn between wanting to hold my parents accountable and wanting to move on with my life. She said, "Sometimes holding people accountable doesn't mean dragging them through the mud. It just means making sure they know their actions have consequences." And she honestly convinced me. This wasn't about revenge. It was about making sure my parents couldn't take advantage of me or anyone else ever again. The settlement wasn't perfect, but it was a way to close this chapter and start fresh. With that in mind, I agreed to the settlement. The paperwork was finalized a few weeks later. My parents paid the agreed amount, and I dropped the civil suit. It wasn't an easy decision, but it felt like the right one. The money gave me the freedom to start focusing on my future, and the legal agreement ensured they couldn't pull something like this again. But even with the settlement in place, things weren't magically fixed. My relationship with my parents was beyond repair. They'd made their choices, and I'd made mine. We were still technically family, but it didn't feel that way anymore. The trust was gone, and I didn't see a path to rebuilding it. The settlement also didn't erase the lingering tension with the rest of the family. Some relatives were supportive, telling me I'd done the right thing, while others accused me of being too harsh. I stopped engaging with those who wanted to lecture me about family loyalty. I'd had enough of that guilt-tripping nonsense to last a lifetime. As for Madison, she stayed out of the settlement entirely. I don't know if it was because she didn't care or because our parents told her to back off. Either way, I wasn't interested in hearing from her. She'd made her choices, and I had no intention of letting her back into my life. In the end, I came to terms with something that was hard to accept. I couldn't change what my parents or Madison had done, but I could control how I chose to move forward. Letting go didn't mean forgiving them or pretending their betrayal didn't hurt. It meant refusing to let their choices define me anymore. They'd made their decisions, and now it was up to me to reclaim my life. I am now focusing entirely on my business. Using the settlement money, I was finally able to kickstart the dream I'd been putting off for years. Every small milestone felt like a victory. For once, I wasn't tied down by anyone else's expectations or chaos. I was building something entirely on my own. But I won't lie, it hasn't been easy. Some days, the anger and hurt still creep in, and I catch myself replaying everything in my head. I think about how much they took from me, how easily they dismissed my plans and dreams as if they didn't matter. And yet, those moments are becoming fewer and farther between. Every time I hit a new milestone or take another step forward, I remind myself how far I've come. I'm no longer trapped by their expectations or weighed down by their betrayal. I'm finally living life on my own terms. As for my parents and Madison, I've stopped looking for closure from them. I know now that they'll probably never see what they did as wrong, and that's something I have to live with. It's not my job to fix them, and it's definitely not my job to carry the consequences of their decisions. They've shown me who they are, and I've chosen to move on without them. For the first time, I feel free. Free to make my own choices. Free to pursue the future I've always wanted, and free to live without constantly seeking their approval. If you've made it this far, thanks for sticking with me. Life throws some wild stuff at us, but if there's one thing I've learned, it's that you can take back control, even after the people you trust the most let you down. One step at a time, I'm proving to myself that I'm stronger than the circumstances they put me in. And that's a victory no one can take away.